I want to talk to you today a little bit about some material in chapter 19 in your textbook. And you have your textbook there. If you don't have it, you might want to run and grab it real quick, put this on pause, and once you have it, turn to page 663. There's a map there. It's labeled the North Atlantic System, and that will show you this trade that's often referred to as triangular trade that circulated around the Atlantic between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And this is the engine of wealth of the 1700s. And let me just describe a little bit of what you're seeing on that map. You'll see a lot of ports in Europe, and then their routes that they brought the routes down to the west coast of Africa, where they brought manufactured goods, is usually what it's labeled as there on your map. That included things that Africans would have wanted, like mostly iron goods, like shovels, axes, even hammers, and brass pots, those sorts of things, and even muskets as well, which often caused a lot of chaos in Africa as well. And along that west coast of Africa, where you see those ports, those were just usually forts that were controlled by European powers, but many of the English ones would have been controlled by the Royal African Company, which had monopolistic power, or they had a monopoly over trading in enslaved persons there. And this slave trade grows from the 1500s, 1600s, and reaches its peak by the middle of the 1700s. Because of labor shortages in the Americas. And then I want to point out that middle passage. There's actually a map of the middle passage as well. You can see there specifically on page 665. And this is going to be a particularly important part of that triangular trade, because the commodities being carried, and commodities is a word that we use for labeling any economic item of value, but in this case, of course, it was human flesh or human beings. It was labor. It was people. It was enslaved person. Sometimes I use the word enslaved person instead of saying slave, because it reminds us that these weren't just commodities like bricks of coal or rum or guns or things like that. These were actual people, and that is the middle passage. You also see there a picture of a slave ship, which would have been used to across all of these trade routes around that triangle from Europe to Africa to the Caribbean or to the Americas. These ships were regulated pretty early on, and actually became some of the first regulated trade ships in world history. Now, they were regulated to limit the number of people that could be imprisoned on them. They were labeled because of that, but they were. The reason, though, was not to save lives, but to save the value of what was being shipped. It was actually insurance companies that regulated these ships. But that gives you an indication of how valuable they were. So take a close look at that slave ship that you see there on page 669. The middle passage is this important chapter, you might say, even section of the history of the African diaspora from Africa. Diaspora is a word that you should be aware of. It means a dispersal of people. You see the African diaspora goes mostly across the Atlantic to North America, to the Caribbean, and to South America. And then this adds to what is sometimes called the Creolization of the Americas. This refers to the various different hues, skin colors of the people who would inhabit these places. In the Caribbean, particularly, you would have lots of mixes of European, African, and Native American descent, and these people were often known as Creoles. And the main commodities that were being traded here that were so valuable were coffee, sugar, which included rum, guns, and of course enslaved persons. So the Middle Passage, though, was that leg of that trade route that included human beings, and it's called the Middle Passage because even by the time the people got on these boats in Africa, they'd probably traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles from their original home. Then the Middle Passage, which is probably the most difficult part of the passage, was the thousands and thousands of miles across the Atlantic Ocean. And even then, when they reached a port like Havana or Columbia, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, even Brazil, then they might have hundreds of miles more to travel. So that Middle Passage, the passage over the ocean, was referred to as just that, a Middle Passage. It was a huge and dangerous, and many people lost their lives, in fact, deadly journey for those who had to make that difficult trip. And then once they reached those ports in the Caribbean or in North America, those ships would be washed down, and on the same shelves that had human cargo, and even those chains sometimes still on those shelves, which are used to bind and imprison people, the valuable cargo of rum or molasses from sugar or indigo, even coffee, would be loaded onto those same shelves and shipped back to European ports. So this gives you a little bit of a description of that triangular trade route. I want to talk in another video with you about how slavery would differ at this time, would change, and would be different from earlier forms of slavery. Okay, so I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching and listening.